All right, Ags, how you doing? Hope you're doing well. You might guess it's a sunny summer day here in Texas. Do what you need to do. Stay inside or stay out or get outside, socially distance, get a little sun, get that vitamin D going. And we're going to talk about actually a number of stories today. This is the second part of our discussion about applications relating to different types of forces. And that's going to lead us right into talking about Newton's laws of motion, which we're going to do in our next episode. So this one's going to be relatively short. The focus of today is going to be finishing up with fluid drag and then friction. So there are a number of stories to tell here, which I think are pretty interesting. At least I hope you think so as well. We're going to start off, we just started this story last time, and this is the story about the evolution, the development of the cycling helmet, how it's changed, and why this cycling helmet was important, this particular one. This is Greg LeMond's helmet. You also notice his posture is a bit different than the fellow next to him. Notice the person next to him is not wearing it at all. So there was a study done a couple of years after Greg LeMond won the 1988 Tour de France, and the difference between winning and losing was this helmet. So this is a gull wing helmet. Like a gull wing, it is very aerodynamic. It reduces fluid drag by reducing largely the coefficient of friction, and based on the big hair I see right next to him, probably the area exposed to those air molecules as well. So he's pushing fewer air molecules out of the way. The flow over the gull wing is going to be relatively laminar until the very end. As long as he keeps his head straight, looking ahead, he's in good shape. When he puts his head down, then we're going to see, we actually have an Aggie wind tunnel clip to look at here in just a bit. And we're going to see that that makes a difference. Okay, so this won the Tour de France. It works like a bird wing or an airplane wing, incredibly aerodynamic, reduces, as long as you have that head straight, reduces the coefficient of drag and the area exposed, those air molecules. It's great, but were there some problems? Well, there are, because you probably noticed that this type of helmet, most cyclists don't wear it today, especially who are in major competition like the Tour de France or the Olympics. So let's talk about why that changed. I mean, you're changing from a bird wing. Bird wings are incredibly aerodynamic, or they would have developed a different type of wing shape in order to fly, in order to stay up there and to be aerodynamic and light. So what was the trade-off? Well, it has to do with some of the problems with this helmet. Now, it's made of styrofoam, so it's light, so the mass isn't really that big a deal. But these styrofoam helmets didn't have any grooves or aeration. So that meant that they were really hot. Styrofoam is kind of a blown polymer, or it's hard to even call it a plastic, but it's kind of a plastic. Styrofoam is basically a blown material that has a lot of air pockets in there. What the air pockets do is act like insulation. So that meant that that heat that was coming from your head can't escape. About 15 to 20% of the heat that you get rid of is through the head. There was an old wives' tale that used to say it was about 70 or 80%, but it's about 15 to 20%. But that's a significant amount, especially when you're sweating. It can make a really big deal. So this helmet was hot. If you put your head down, that greatly increased the area exposed, the air molecules, and increased the coefficient of drag, and therefore increased fluid drag. This is really important for world-class cyclists because the amount of energy that they have to use to overcome fluid drag is 25, 30%. It's a lot, especially because they could be going at speeds of 40 miles an hour plus. Okay, so what's the other issue? Well, the other issue is actually something that's really positive for a bird or an airplane. It is lift. This is also a problem with race cars. Race cars potentially have lift. They have a spoiler to help keep them down. We'll talk more about that as time goes on. So whether it's an airplane wing or a bird wing, this ability to produce lift comes from something we call Bernoulli's principle. And Bernoulli's principle is a mathematical formula, but basically it says there's an inverse relationship between the velocity of the air moving, or the velocity of the fluid moving, because it could be water as well, and the amount of pressure that that fluid is exerting. The faster it's going, the lower the pressure. So if, let's say, we have a bird or an airplane traveling from left to right, here's the wing. So the air is moving in the opposite direction as the wing is moving through the air. So because the wing is curved on the top side and flat on the bottom side, the distance that the air has to travel is greater on top than it is on the bottom. So if you have a greater distance divided by a certain amount of time it takes to clear the wing, then that's an increased velocity. On the bottom of the wing, you're traveling a shorter distance for a given period of time, so distance divided by delta t, that's velocity, so the velocity is lower. So the next question you might be thinking was, okay, the air is moving faster, but why would that reduce the pressure? Well, it actually has to do with kinetic energy of air molecules. So air molecules at 70 degrees, or today's like 98 degrees, they're moving around. In fact, a day like today, they're moving around really fast. Lots of kinetic energy. So that means that they're banging on surfaces more often, believe it or not. The advantage, well, one of the issues with warm air is because of this large kinetic energy, the air molecules actually are farther apart, which actually reduces the pressure, but they do tend to collide a lot. So as the air is moving slower on the bottom, there's actually a greater probability, because these air molecules are moving in one direction, but they're also kind of going up and down and here and there. There's a greater probability of these air molecules hitting the bottom of the wing because the air is moving slower than the probability of each molecule colliding with the top of the wing as the air is moving over the wing. So that means that there are fewer air molecules colliding with the top of the wing, more air molecules colliding with the bottom of the wing. And even though air is light, it has a low density compared with something like water, it's not insignificant. And the fact that these molecules are hitting on the bottom creates what we call a pressure difference. So low velocity on the bottom means higher pressure, higher velocity on top means lower pressure. And anytime you have a pressure difference across a material or surface, you're going to create a force. Pressure differences create a force from high pressure to low pressure. It's like the weather. So when there's high pressure in one area and low pressure in another area. So right now we're kind of near, it's beginning of July. We have probably high pressure aloft, and because of the heat, low pressure near the ground. So there's some wind going back and forth. You probably notice in Texas, even in July or August, we usually have some wind, and that's based on kind of the unique climatology that we have this time of year. So we have, if the upper level high gets right over us and presses down, then it gets really hot, and then sometimes there's even less of a breeze. So this is bad enough. It's going to be in the upper 90s, sunny. There's a little bit of a breeze. It makes it feel slightly better outside. But like if you're going to mow the lawn or get out and walk your dog and do it while, of course, socially distancing and being safe, you want to do it when there's a little bit of a breeze and it's not too hot. So that means sometimes in the morning or sometimes late in the afternoon. And because we're fairly west in the central time zone, that usually means like 7, 8, or 9 o'clock as it's just starting to get cooler and a little bit darker. Okay, so whether it's a bird or an airplane wing, as they're moving through the air, there's going to be lift created. Okay, that's great if you're in a 747 or if you're a seagull. It's not great for Greg LeMond or someone wearing a true gull wing helmet, because that lift that's going to be created, it's really going to crane the neck. There's some gull wing helmets. I'm going to show you one here in a little bit. They're designed a little bit better that ironically don't create quite as much lift. And they're easy to keep secure, but cyclists only use them in time trials because the rest of the time, sometimes when they're pedaling hard, you got to put your head down. This can be a problem. If you lift your head up, coefficient of drag goes up, the area exposed, the air molecules goes up. That increases the fluid drag. Okay, so this is hot. It's got a lift related problem. And if you put your head down, then it's no longer aerodynamic. So what was the next step? Well, the next step was something we called a cutoff gull wing design. A lot of times if you get just a typical cycling helmet you can put on your head, and it's not a true, it's not a true world-class cycling helmet. You'll see some styrofoam helmets that have this cutoff gull wing. Cars, especially race cars, have the back end of the vehicle cut off. And that actually doesn't help the aerodynamics. There's a trade-off. You actually get more fluid drag because the coefficient of drag goes up. And that's true for a cutoff gull wing helmet. But what you get in return is less lift. So that's the trade-off that we've made, whether it's a race car or it's a cutoff gull wing helmet for a cyclist. So people were wearing these for about 10 years, and then we were doing some additional work, and some clues also came from birds. If we look at the feathers of the birds, between each feather, there's a little groove. You have the spine of each feather, and between them, you have this little bitty groove. And that allows the air to flow nicely in what we call laminar flow. That's smooth flow, which reduces the coefficient of drag. So that was a clue in terms of an additional design, because we'd made this trade-off. We'd cut off the gull wing, but you couldn't put your head down still. This helmet was still hot. And we now had an increased coefficient of drag. So let me show you a helmet. This is actually with Lance Armstrong in a moment. Hold on a second. Okay, here we have Lance Armstrong, and he's got kind of a unique helmet. This looks really strange, but this is, again, kind of a gull wing design. Notice when he put his head down. Hold on, right there, perfect. Okay, if you do this, this is problematic. Folks only use this usually in the time trial, where they had a course that was fairly straight. They could keep their head up. Another thing we need to mention is notice that their posture, they keep their back almost parallel with the ground. When we switch again, we'll take a look at Greg LeMond and again emphasize that posture. That reduces the area exposed of that cyclist's body to air molecules. You push fewer air molecules out of the way. It makes their body more aerodynamic. So let's take a look at this, because he's going to put his head down, and they're going to use basically a wind tunnel where they're going to throw air at him, basically take a huge fan and throw it at him, and then we're going to throw literally smoke at him. And the smoke's going to tell us about laminar flow versus turbulent flow. This is one of the reasons why they don't wear this helmet very much. It's hard to keep your head up like that for 100 kilometers. Okay, comes the smoke. There we go. So you can see there's relatively smooth flow, a little bit of turbulence in here. This turbulence is where you have kind of eddies and kind of chaotic movement of the air molecules. That increases the coefficient of drag and therefore increases the fluid drag. So this looks pretty good. Not too bad, as long as you keep your head up. In fact, he's probably got his head down a little bit too much. but it's not a bad helmet. Okay, next we're going to look at a short clip of what happens when you put a basically gull wing helmet down. And we're going to look at a huge increase in the area exposed as air molecules, and the coefficient of drag is going to go up. We know this because take a look at what's going to happen to that laminar flow. Here we see nice flow of air in the smoke perfectly. That's telling us what's going on. This is here at Texas A&M. Let me move this down so you can see this title down here. There it is, Texas A&M low speed wind tunnel test. There we go. So this is right here on our campus. Go. Okay, he's going to put his head down. Check out what happens. Oh yeah, look at all of that turbulence. That's greatly increasing the coefficient of drag and therefore the fluid drag. Let's take a look at it one more time. Oh, lots of turbulence. Cool. Okay. Okay, so the cutoff gull wing design, that helped to reduce the lift. And now we're trying to figure out a way that we can have something like a cutoff gull wing design, but have our cake and eat it too. We don't want to trade off. We want it all. So we want to reduce that coefficient of drag. How are we going to do that? Well, again, we had clues from gulls, from bird wings, and that they have this feathering, and the feathering increases the laminar flow. So one of the next ideas, and this is going to accomplish like 3 things at once. These grooves in the helmet, those is the same company, Giro, that makes the helmets. These grooves are going to do a few things. They're going to act like feathering and enhance laminar flow going over the top of the helmet, especially compared with a cutoff gull wing that we saw in the 1980s. This is kind of like our 2008 edition. This is our 90s edition. This is our 80s edition. This is our 21st century edition. So when we increase laminar flow and therefore reduce turbulence, what we're doing is decreasing the coefficient of drag. If we looked at how much area with the helmet and with the head, because the head's part of the system then, it works a little bit like microvilli in a sense. In your gut, you get greater surface area. So the area exposed probably, if anything, is actually increasing slightly, but the coefficient of drag drops so much, that's the dominant effect. So don't get that mixed up during an exam or in the future. That's the primary effect. Okay, so another advantage is that especially as your head is sweating and you're really hot, right? There's going to be a lot more evaporation. This is far cooler than those styrofoam helmets. They're not really much lighter, and then you're talking about 70 kilogram people, and you're only talking about, you know, maybe 40, 50 grams. So it's the mass and the weight are not a significant issue. And because, look, you still have the cutoff gull wing, you don't get a significant amount of lift. So the heat problem, the lift problem, and the cutoff gull wing issue that increases the coefficient of drag, all of those are solved with this type of helmet. And if you fall down, it's almost as good in terms of protection, maybe better depending upon the way you fall, than the styrofoam helmet. So it's nice when you can have your cake and eat it too. So even though, like I said, we started off with a cutoff gull wing, we kept that in mind, and we took another idea from birds, that feathering effect, as we look at, I think we've got a wing coming up right here. So when we look at the wings and the feathers on the wings, so between each feather, there's a small groove, kind of like that. So within that groove between each of the feathers, you have enhanced laminar flow of that material. And you probably notice in the feathers themselves, you have basically that hard protein, collagen, running down the feathers. It's probably got some laminin in there as well. I've got to look and see what proteins are. I'm pretty sure it's collagen and laminin. Um, maybe, let's see. That type of feathering enhances, like I said, the laminar flow. So that's another thing that, again, that the grooves are doing, reducing that coefficient of drag through increased laminar flow, reduced turbulent flow, and you're reducing the fluid drag while reducing the amount of lift, because you don't have as much of a pressure difference across the helmet. You still have that cutoff gull wing design. So it's really about the best of all three worlds, and you've been able to make big progress on the heat related problems. Okay, so let's say you have a big truck. Well, big trucks are going to have major problems. They have a large area that's exposed those air molecules. So that freight truck is pushing lots of air molecules out of the way. They're pushing back. If you've swum and you're trying to paddle, if you're doing breaststroke or even freestyle, you probably notice the water's pushing you back. It's really slowing you down, making it difficult. So because there's so many air molecules that get pushed out of the way, they push back. So really, you could argue this is part of Newton's third law, the law of action and reaction. And then you get lots of turbulent flow because you don't have a very smooth surface. You've got this very rough cornered surface. You probably noticed on some trucks that in the cab and in the truck itself that you have more curvature than you used to in some of the trucks, and that improves the aerodynamics. But the bottom line is you have a large area exposed those air molecules and a large coefficient of drag, and that means huge air drag, fluid drag, and that's why mileage for these vehicles is not very high. Even for a diesel engine truck, which most of the big trucks will have. And the diesel engine, it just lasts longer. It doesn't get nearly as hot as a gasoline or auto engine. And it can produce a lot of torque. It doesn't get up to kind of the high RPMs that an automobile will. So you won't see diesel engine, they probably have them, but you won't see too many NASCAR races with diesel engine vehicles. It's just not going to happen. By the way, I think I may have mentioned this in another one of the lectures, but the original fuel for diesel fuel, they actually in the 1800s, it would have been the 1880s, we barely were using oil and gasoline. So it was really brand new when auto engines were developed. And at that time, with refining, it wasn't sophisticated enough to separate a more crude portion, which we know now as diesel fuel. And that's because diesel fuels don't need a high octane. They don't need a high explosive capacity in order to burn. You could actually use something like lamp oil and get it to work. But that's a clue. They were originally designed to run on vegetable oil. And if you actually put vegetable oil in a diesel engine, I don't recommend doing this, and you don't, I think, have to alter the engine very much, because I mean they're geared today towards diesel fuel, but the original ones were designed actually for vegetable oil. If you put vegetable oil in a slightly modified diesel engine, the exhaust will, and I don't recommend smelling exhaust, but the exhaust will smell like actually French fries. So pretty cool. Someday when we have more biofuels, and I think with this COVID, I always think when humans have challenges, we've had a lot of great challenges over the last century. We've had pandemics like the 1918 Spanish flu, 2 world wars, a Cold War. We've had Great Depression. We've had Great Recession. We've had all kinds of issues. I think this pandemic is finally going to get it through people's heads, and this is related to the Center for Disease Control. What's the part that everybody forgets? It's not the full name. The last part of that name is prevention. The name of the CDC is actually the Center for Disease Control, which is one thing, and prevention, which is always better, right? So I really think that we're going to start to use science more because we have to in order to prevent calamities like this. This is going to include everything from climate change, which is happening whether we like it or not. Well, the thing about science and the thing about viruses, you're probably noticing they don't care what your opinion is about them. They're going to do their thing. So like CO2 is going to do its thing, and its thing is to absorb radiation in the infrared range. That's what it does. That's all it does, pretty much. Well, no, plants can, of course, use it to build cellulose and all kinds of cool stuff. But as far as what it does in the air, it absorbs energy in the infrared light, in the light range or infrared range, and therefore retains heat because infrared is basically the way we not only perceive, but we experience heat that we can measure in terms of temperature. Okay, so getting back to this, the Aggie freight truck. Turbulence is going to slow this sucker down. So as I said, you probably seen some trucks around today that are designed that are a bit more aerodynamic than they were back in the day. Okay, as we're going through this equation, and what we're doing with equations in this class, we're using them to be able to explain real world phenomena. That's where applied science comes in. That's what you have to be able to do. So, when there's a virus like the COVID virus, and we're trying to design and come up with medications as well as vaccines, they're going to be related to specific properties that the proteins and the lipid membrane and the RNA has in this particular virus. So vaccines are either going to target the RNA or the spike protein or some amino acid sequence in the spike protein. So here we're going to apply this equation. One of the nice things about biomechanics is that there are a few exceptions. When we talk about turbulence, the math gets wicked. So we're mostly going to talk about that conceptually, but there's some really hairy major calculus, double integrals, and all kinds of cool stuff in order to be able to calculate that. But here we have a relatively simple equation. There's a direct relationship between the coefficient of drag and the fluid drag. The higher the coefficient of drag, the greater the fluid drag. The greater the area exposed to air molecules or water molecules, the greater the fluid drag. The greater the density of the fluid, the greater the fluid drag. So if you're doing water aerobics, right, you're moving molecules around that have a much greater density than the air. It's a lot more tiring. It's a good aerobic workout. When a ball is hit up in Denver, or maybe even Lubbock, because Lubbock's at about 3,400 feet in altitude, the air is less dense, and that means the ball will actually travel farther. So if a pitcher gets traded to the Colorado Rockies, they're actually not happy because there are going to be more home runs hit against them, and it's going to get their ERA up, and they have less of a chance of becoming a Hall of Famer. I'm trying to think, maybe there's one Colorado Rocky pitcher who's made the Major League Hall of Fame. There might be one, and that's about it. Okay, so notice what's a direct relationship between the air density and the range. So you can hit a baseball farther, a golf ball farther, as the air becomes less dense up at altitude. There's Denver. It's a mile high, as you know, 5,280 feet. Here's another thing that we experience even here near sea level. I think College Station's about 250, 300 feet in altitude. So rarefied air compared with Houston, I guess. But Austin's about 1,000 feet, I think, in altitude. And as I was saying, Lubbock's something like 3,500 feet. So as we increase altitude, there we go. There's my row. As we increase in altitude, the density decreases. However, temperature and humidity also have an effect. The temperature effect, I think, is pretty intuitive, pretty straightforward. Most people know that as air gets warmer, it gets less dense. And that's because of the kinetic energy of the air molecules. They bounce off each other harder, they fly apart. So there's greater space in between the air molecules. And because there's greater space between the air molecules, 1 mole of air, which is 6.023 times 10 to the 23rd, that's Avogadro's number, if you remember that. I had a brother they used to call avocado's number. So it's partly the way I remember it. I usually think of an avocado, and then I go to Avogadro. Anyway, so on a hot day, the air is lighter. The baseball is going to travel farther. Golf ball is going to travel farther. So where do golfers like Tiger Woods, where do most of them live? Even the Europeans, where do they live? They live in Florida, right? Because it's warm and they can almost all year round, they can hit the ball a long way. If their joints get sore, they can warm up pretty easily. So the ball will travel farther. There's actually a greater elasticity of the collision between the golf ball and the club head as well. So the ball goes farther. They're all very happy. There's another thing about being in Florida that people kind of don't think about in terms of increasing the distance that a golf ball or baseball will travel. And that's actually the humidity, or to be specific, the partial pressure of water vapor. So the more water vapor there is in the air, and here's where it's counterintuitive, instead of being more dense, it's actually less dense. Now, this has to do with the feeling that we get when we're in hot, humid conditions. The air feels what? It feels heavy. That's the way we perceive it. And that's because the air that we breathe in is no longer cool, but it's no longer dry. So as we get way into our nasal passages, we're talking about 98 degrees, same temperature as outside right now, but it's 100% humidity. So when we get drier and cooler air coming in, our nasal passages and even our mouth detect that, and our brain interprets that as being drier air and lighter, even though it's actually not true that it's lighter. And let's take a look why. So it's really pretty straightforward. It has to do with the molecular weight of dry air versus water vapor. So as you know, dry air is going to be what, 20.92% oxygen and 78% nitrogen. So into the nitrogen, molecular nitrogen we see in the air is 28 grams per mole. So a mole of air occupies 22.4 liters at standard temperature and pressure. So 28 grams per mole. For O2, it's 32 grams per mole. So dry air is roughly about 29 grams per mole, something like that. Water vapor, so each oxygen is 16 grams, so 16 plus 16 is 32. Nitrogen is 14 plus 14, that's where 28 comes from. So it's not magic. For H2O, oxygen is 16, and then hydrogen, of course, each one is 1. So 16 plus 1 is 18 grams per mole. So not quite 50% of the density of, a little over 50% of the density for versus dry air. 29 grams per mole for dry air, 18 grams per mole for water vapor. So when you add water vapor to the air gets less dense. The water vapor actually rises. Now, usually you'll end up in clouds. That's why the clouds in the troposphere, do we have any out there? Not today. We had some yesterday, but today the high pressure is settling in. It's getting hot. That high pressure presses the air down. And when you squeeze air molecules, air, unlike water, is adiabatic, meaning you can squeeze and change its volume. When you decrease its volume, it gets hotter. When you increase its volume, it gets cooler. That's how air conditionings work. You have basically Freon that becomes a gas, and expands rapidly. And as it expands rapidly, it cools, and then the air goes over. Well, today it's a special kind of freon that doesn't affect the ozone layer up in the stratosphere. Actually, the ozone layer has gotten thicker for the most part over the past 20 years. So that's a good thing. That also can contribute to climate change through relatively complex phenomenon. So that part is actually better. We still have the CO2 problem. The good news is with the COVID virus and with economic activity worldwide slowing down for a while, that is probably going to slow the rise of CO2. Maybe we'll see the Earth catch up a little bit. We'll see. Probably not in about another year or so. But what you're going to see during your lifespan is a conversion from fossil fuels to clean energy. It's just going to happen. The question is, are we going to reach 50% in 2035 or 2045 or 2055? That's really the only question pretty much out there. So a lot of that technology, biofuels, wind, solar, they're all getting a lot more efficient. China, they've partly because they're incredibly polluted, are making a great effort to try to increase the amount of clean energy that they're developing. So whenever we get over this COVID virus, that's an area. In fact, I think before 2016, 17, it was actually the first or second largest growing sector in the economy. And I think that's going to happen again, as I think humans are going to have to adapt to this situation and say, you know what, this prevention idea, it's a pretty good idea. And I think we're going to be using that in both health, energy, everything that we do. So that's where I think a lot of the jobs are going to be in the next 40 to 50 years during your lifespan. They're going to be in the energy domain. They're going to be in the biomedical and health domain. So many of you are choosing those types of areas now. Okay, so the bottom line is that hot, humid air is less dense. The ball goes farther, a lot farther. Baseball players, we may be starting late in July, but this is the time they like to get out there, July and August, because that air is lighter, the ball's going to travel farther, they can hit more home runs. You probably noticed during the course of the year, there aren't as many home runs hit in April as there are in June, July, and August. Sometimes in September, people are getting tired, especially if it's the pitchers, you can take advantage of that as well. But sometimes it's a bit windier in September, and that makes it more difficult to hit the ball out because it's hard to make good contact. Okay, so the air is actually less dense. Again, counterintuitive because that's not what we feel. So this is where I'm going to talk about us as a species or us as a race, the human race. A lot of things we have in common. Perceptions of things like color. I'm a little colorblind, but I can see blues and yellows pretty good, and most reds. Greens I don't see too well. I'm thinking about getting one of these special glasses that is supposed to vision correct. Green's not my favorite color anyway, so I'm like, if I can see more green, is that going to be a good thing? If the grass turns brown, I might say, well, like, maybe I can't tell, even though the way I usually guess is that brown, to me, I see the yellow part of it, and that's kind of how I do that. A green light, by the way, looks white to me. Don't be afraid if I'm driving. Yeah, I can tell where the green light is versus the yellow light, which is in the middle, and the red light, which is either on the top or on the right side. So don't worry about that. I can see they're red, yellow, so don't be afraid. Okay, so this has to do with our perception of reality. So blues, when people can see blues, they look somewhat similar. It looks cool. People could describe blue as a cool color. We notice it associated with the atmosphere. Red's a bit hotter, warmer. Yellow's really hot and vibrant, right? So because of that information, we can share that. That's incredibly important for us as hunter-gatherers because we had to be able to choose the right plants. So like this mushroom, I can eat this mushroom. This one will kill me. This one gives me a weird trip or something like that, right? or certain flowers. We noticed that's going to be associated with a root that we could eat, or maybe it would end up being a certain kind of spice that we could use to kind of heat up a meal, give it some taste, as well as, of course, a lot of herbs and spices are used to be able to preserve food. So before the refrigerators, either we could find a way to keep it cool, which is usually to dig something in the ground. A lot of ancient houses basically dug their house into the ground so they have cool areas. That's kind of where wine cellars, in a sense, come in. You can salt something, you can dry it out. You can add a stable oil like olive oil, for example, which has a lot of monounsaturates that can be used to preserve stuff. So I made some pesto sauce. It'll keep forever because A, it's in the refrigerator and it's cooler, but B, it's got olive oil, and the olive oil actually helps to preserve things. Ironically, sucrose is a relatively good preservative. That's why, you know, cakes and etc. can last a bit of time before they really get nasty. As I said, salting something, vinegar. So pickling is another way to be able to keep things. So the point is that things like taste and smell and color, we had to be able to share that information, often orally, our ancestors did, or we didn't eat, or if we ate something, it wasn't too good. When meat goes rancid, you can tell by smell or taste, etc. So you want, or if something was infected with a bacteria, you can kind of taste what's going on with bacteria. So our ancestors had to be very careful about that. Okay, so my point here is that as a human race, we all share this type of stuff, and that's because, like I said, our ancient ancestors were hunter-gatherers, and then along the way we collected some farmer genes. So humans have farmer genes. So Aggie, whoop, a little bit of that. And for me, in a hot day like this, yeah, I'm going to sweat like crazy. We talked about sweat being one of our ability to sweat a lot being one of our adaptations to heat. So our ancestors came, as you probably know, from the Rift Valley in Africa. And so Kenya, folks from Kenya would probably look a lot like what our ancestors were like, regardless of where our more immediate ancestors are from now. So for me, it's Italy, a little bit of Germany, and Italian. So my stomach's Italian, but my skin's Irish, that kind of thing. So my more immediate ancestors are lighter skin, and that's an adaptation. The light skin, that's nothing like what our original ancestors looked like. They were dark skinned because they grew and developed and evolved in an area where there's a lot of sunlight because they were near the equator. So they look more like this. Kenyans, folks from Sri Lanka, and Aborigines in Oceania. The first group that came out of Africa went down towards India, southern India, Sri Lanka. There was a land bridge to some of Oceania and to Australia. So the folks you see here, that gives us an idea of probably what our original ancestors look like. And some of the adaptations since then are relatively small. The skin color, melanin content, that's just one gene, melanin, for the most part. There's sometimes a couple of other genes that get involved in it, but it's usually one. And so I look like this because in Ireland, there's a lot of cloudiness. So you don't get too many days that look like this in Ireland. That meant to get enough vitamin D. Remember, vitamin D is made in your skin. My ancestors had to get rid of a lot of the melanin. That took a long time. My ancestors would have been probably Indo-European who came from the middle of the Caucasus region and what is now Georgia and then southern Russia. And then they moved towards what is now France and the upper part of Spain and then over to Ireland. And along the way, they ran into cloudier and cloudier conditions. And so the skin got lighter and lighter. My mother is Italian. On the other hand, her skin's really dark. It's definitely olive color. So I did not get that coloring from her. So part of the point is that as a human race, and actually the term races is, or the term race is unfortunate because genetically they don't exist. There's enough admixture and a limited amount of difference among folks that it's really, from a genetic standpoint, the diversity is modest. Yeah, a few genes can cause problems related to metabolic disease, and there's certainly big differences in culture and where people come from and all kinds of socioeconomic issues. But in terms of genetics, we're way more alike than we are not. So that means we can communicate well with people from all over the world, especially once we understand a little bit about language. It has to do with the fact that a lot of what we experience in terms of the environment, we can often share fairly effectively with other people regardless. So, all right, so we're all in it together. We're going to do a little problem here with fluid drag. And this has to do with the last term. And that's the square of the relative velocity, like a difference between airspeed and ground speed. So I'm going to pick the last Tour de France winner, 2019, Egan Bernal. I think he was the first person out of South America to win the Tour de France. Let's say they're riding at 20 meters per second with a 5 meter per second tailwind. So we're going to take the difference between the two, find the relative velocity. That's going to be proportional to the fluid drag. Remember, if the relative velocity doubles, fluid drag quadruples, because this is a power function. In the last half of the time trial, it looks like, move that, there we go. Things sometimes move around. He's pedaling at 18 meters per second into a 5 meter per second headwind. So now the wind's going to be coming from the opposite direction. When we subtract the two, we're going to get because one is in the opposite direction as a negative number, we're going to get a larger number. So these are the two comparisons. Egan Bernal is pedaling at 20 meters per second, a little over 40 miles an hour. And with a tailwind, that's going to be in the same direction. Here's the 5 meter per second headwind. And on the way back, he's going at 18 meters per second. Because it takes a significant amount of extra force to overcome this fluid drag, he's not going to be able to pedal quite as fast. Okay, so there's a number of ways to be able to solve for this. What I did was I developed a ratio. I assumed that during the time trial that the air pressure, Egan Bernal's equipment, his posture remained the same. So the coefficient of drag, the area exposed, the density of the air, that was constant. That didn't change. So that meant that any change in the relative velocity accounted for any change in the fluid drag. So if this doubled, then fluid drag quadrupled. So I set it up as a ratio. So I'm going to take the difference in the first half of the time trial. This is the difference between ground speed and airspeed. So that's 15 meters per second. That's how fast the air molecules are going past Egan Bernal. On the second half of the time trial, he's going into a headwind. And so now it's 18 minus negative 5 meters per second. That's 23 meters per second. So we're having to overcome a much greater relative velocity. So there should be a substantial, very large difference in fluid drag. So I've set it up like a ratio. The fluid drag in the second half of the time trial divided by the fluid in the first half of the time trial. That's equal to 23 squared divided by 15 squared. I should have my meters per second there. So we got 529 divided by 225. They would be both in meters squared per second squared. So units cancel out. We're left with something unitless. 2.35 times as much fluid drag. So if I express that as a percentage, there's two ways to do it. First, I'll take the numerator, subtracting that to the denominator, divide by the denominator, multiply by 100, that's 135. Or think about like doubling the price of cereal. You double the price of HEB cereal, and it goes from like $2 to $4. then that's an increase in 100%. So the way you calculate that is you calculate the ratio, subtract unity or 1 from that, multiply by 100, and magically you get the same number. No, it's not magic, it's just math. Okay, so another application, we're getting into hurricane season, and we got the COVID virus, and it's 100 degrees and still around. We hopefully will not get into 2 disasters at once. We don't need that. There may not be as much shear force in the mid-atmosphere during this hurricane season, so we don't need another 2017. So fingers crossed. Keep in mind, though, let's say that the air movement, we're going to assume the ground's not moving at all, right? We don't have a hurricane and a earthquake and sharks, sharknadoes, and COVID. Oh my goodness. If we go from a Cat 1 to a Cat 5 hurricane, you're doubling the relative velocity, but that means the fluid drag is the square of that. So again, 4 times as much. And if we calculated the energy, because we'd have to actually take the integral of the change in velocity, you actually get 6 times as much energy. So this is why we get really concerned about major hurricanes. Hurricane, I think it was Michael, came ashore on in the panhandle of Florida a couple of years ago, and they thought it was going to be a Cat 3. And when it landed, we know now it's a Cat 5, and it just became a massive eraser. So there were a couple of small towns that are right on the shore that got almost wiped out, and the only structures that survived really well for the most part had foundations that were way into the ground, had reinforced concrete, that's concrete with a lot of steel in it, so it could take a lot, and they were raised way off the ground, so some of those survived. But this is again another reason why prevention is so important. If you build a house that can stand a hurricane, and we're capable of building houses and even structures in like downtown Houston that can take winds of 200 miles an hour. We're capable of doing that. And also dealing with storm surge as well, because often, as you know, flooding and storm surge are the things that really take people's lives. So watch out with hurricane season. Hopefully we'll escape. Okay, so now we're going to talk about friction for a while. This discussion will be a bit shorter, but friction is kind of a resisting force where, in a sense, you have 2 forces that are opposing each other that are just slightly offset. So it's like a rubbing force or a chopping force. Sounds like a shear force, doesn't it? Well, people argue that friction is just another type of shear force. So if you rub your hands together, you're generating friction. That's kind of a shear force. Water can basically flow over skin if you're washing your hands, getting rid of those viruses, COVID viruses. Soap up, as you know, for 20 seconds or 2 happy birthdays, 2 rounds of happy birthdays. Cleats and shoes. The interesting thing about friction is it depends upon the surface or material properties of both objects in contact with each other. So, for example, the type of shoes that you might wear on a track versus playing soccer, or maybe a muddy day playing baseball or football, the bottoms of those shoes, or snow, the bottoms of those shoes is going to be completely different depending upon the conditions. So football players often have multiple types of spikes. This is also true sometimes for soccer, international football. So there are 3 types of friction. Static friction. This is where you start off with something that is on the ground and you're trying to move it. It won't slide at first. The coefficient of static friction is usually pretty high. So once you initiate movement, then you have dynamic movement, sliding movement. So when you're rubbing your hands together. So if you push your hands together real hard, we've done this before when we were talking about how joints protect themselves. You probably noticed that the harder you press together, the harder it is to slide them back and forth. So you've really increased the coefficient of friction for static friction. That's exactly what happens. And so what you're doing in a sense for your joints is you're stabilizing them by pressing them together. So once we actually start to slide a piece of furniture, then it gets easier. If you have a smooth surface like snow or even ice, and you have skis or skates, then you can have dynamic friction that's pretty low. Usually dynamic friction is less than static friction, but we can make it really super low. Rolling friction usually has the lowest friction of all, and therefore it has the smallest coefficient of friction. Isn't always the case, but that's kind of what we look for. We think the first wheels, which were developed probably in Babylonia, about 4500 BC, were actually made of wood. As time went on, we used more rubber-like materials. Didn't last as long, but actually the coefficient of friction was quite a bit lower, and they were a bit more stable because they deformed a little bit when they hit the surface. So if you're moving forward and the wheel is rotating, you get some friction underneath, and you got to try to titrate it just right. You want it low, but not too low. If it's too low, then your car starts to slip and slide. This happens when, for example, there's rain on the road, because the coefficient of friction is dependent on the connection between the two surfaces and what's on them. If it's wet or if it's icy, and you have a tire or basically a shoe, then it's going to be a lot more slippery. So on the shoe, you might have these hard rubber or steel spikes that allow you to be able to dig into those conditions. Same thing is actually true for muddy conditions as well. So the interesting thing is, again, when you press your hands together, the greater the force is, and therefore the reaction force. So this is Newton's third law, the law of action reaction. As a weight or a force is pressing on a surface, there's a reaction force pressing back. The larger that is, the greater the amount of friction. Or generating friction, we've got to move or slide something or get it to roll in one direction. So there's an action, and then there's friction moving in the other direction. So the amount of friction is dependent on the reaction force, and it's also dependent on the force that's pulling or sliding or causing the wheel to rotate about a surface. So we can calculate the force for friction as the coefficient of friction there we go, that should be there it is. Coefficient of friction times R, and R is basically the reaction force that's on the surface. So either we're sliding like this, the amount of friction that happens is really the reaction force with like the two hands pressing together. So under slippery conditions, what happens is that coefficient of friction decreases because of the rain, snow and ice under football conditions. This is where the coach is like, just run the ball. Even though I actually think it's a good time to pass, because then the receiver knows where to go, but the defender doesn't. And it's sometimes hard for the defender to catch up with him if the wide receiver has good hands, and today we've got gloves. Passing under these kind of conditions, you're seeing it more and more in football. But notice that his posture is changing. He's leaning over. You got more knee flexion and hip flexion because your foot tends to slip, and you're trying to produce more backwards force as well as that force related to the weight. So as the coefficient of friction goes down for a given reaction force, then the frictional force goes down. The reaction force is related to, if we're dealing with weight, the weight itself times something called the cosine of theta. Theta is the deviation from basically horizontal. So as you go towards conditions where you're going uphill or downhill, things are starting to get slippery. Actually, it doesn't matter whether you're going uphill or downhill, or you're turning. All of these will potentially decrease R. In the case of turning, will decrease the coefficient of friction. So this is where you got to watch out. This is the danger zone. So I don't know if if you guys are Archer fans. This is something actually my kids got me into. It's like, Dad, got to watch the show. I'm like, okay. So yeah, it's interesting. Well, you can get away with a lot in cartoons. That's all I can say. A lot of fun. Anyway, you're in the danger zone because once you start to go either uphill or downhill, then as we look at this equation, the coefficient of friction can change, especially if it's slippery conditions, but let's say that remains constant. As the reaction force changes, and it's going to change as the slope gets higher, whether you're going up or going down, and that's because this angle is going to change. Let's say that you're on a level surface. This angle, or theta, goes to 0. The cosine of 0 is equal to 1. It's unity. If it's 45 degrees, then it's what, 0.707. If it's 30 degrees, I think it's 0.5. So as that angle gets larger and larger, that means the reaction force gets smaller and smaller. If we cut the reaction force in half, that means the frictional force decreases as well. And it can also actually alter the coefficient of friction, especially, like I said, under slippery conditions like this. And these guys are going uphill and around a turn, which would decrease both the coefficient of friction and the normal force, because you got inertial problems. I was going to call them centripetal problems, but they're really inertial problems because these cars want to go straight and you're trying to make them turn. And under slippery conditions, and this is one of the reasons when NASCAR, if it starts raining, they just pretty much stop it. That's partly because there's not as much friction between these tires in the ground as our tires in the ground. They don't have as much grip. That's actually, believe it or not, on purpose, but it does make them a lot less stable. They're also rear-wheel drive, because with rear-wheel drive, you can produce more torque than you can with front-wheel drive. Virtually all the vehicles we have today are front-wheel or four-wheel drive, and that's because you get better traction. And that's the sacrifice that has been made. Japanese cars first started to do that, and because they had a high torque engine, they could actually get significant acceleration while making the car more stable by using front-wheel drive as opposed to rear-wheel drive. However, you can always produce more torque and the car will move faster if it's rear-wheel drive. It's going to slip at first and it can fishtail a bit. But if you have a real sports car, if you buy a sports car and it's not rear-wheel drive, it's not really a sports car. It's just a fun car that's painted red or some cool color. Just imagine what happens though if this angle becomes 9 degrees. That means it's up and down, it's vertical. So the cosine of 9 degrees is 0. So we've got no friction unless we have pairs of static gloves, or in the case of Spider-Man, we basically have little suction cups on the fingers, right? That's what you need. So this is actually another one of the stunts that Tom Cruise did himself. So frightening thing. If you remember, this is Ghost Protocol movie of the Mission Impossible series. I think it was the 4th. It's the 5th. I can't remember. 4th and 5th. This one's my favorite. This is actually one of my favorite scenes. And you probably notice that he's trying to go up a floor, and they're gonna try to embezzle some cool stuff, money. And the problem is there's a dust storm, and the dust storm removes the static ability of those special gloves, and all kinds of crazy things happen. So, so the point is that as this angle theta increases, that reduces the reaction force and therefore reduces the friction. So watch it. If you've got an incline or decline, here's an ultimate incline. That's what, about 1,100 feet above the ground, way above there. That's a stunt right there. Okay, that's a good place to stop. We're going to next time talk about Newton's laws of motion. We're going to get through that, and then we're going to take the next step and basically turn force into this movement, rotation, torque. And that will be a central part of why people move, the way they move. It's going to be the secret of human movement. So be ready. That's coming up next.